Wyoming Territory, 1889. The wind howled low through the cottonwoods as the train screeched to a stop at the last station before Cheyenne, and Tessa Fairley's heart dropped with it. Off the train, the conductor barked, not unkindly, but firm. Your name's been scratched off the list. Groom ain't showing. You head back east or find your own way from here. Tessa clutched her small satchel tighter. Her fingers were trembling. There has to be a mistake, she said, her voice barely above the wind. I was supposed to meet a Mr. Harold Kessler in Cheyenne. He sent for me. The conductor gave a tired shake of his head. He wired 2 days ago. Said he changed his mind. You're not going any farther. The platform was cold beneath her worn boots. She stepped off anyway, blinking against the sun and dust as the train hissed and clanked, and then began to move again, rolling on without her. She stood alone, the last stop before nowhere, clutching the only things she owned. 30 miles west, a cowboy named Prescott Baylor was saddling his mare in a rush. His hat jammed low, coat half-buttoned, boots dusty from the morning's ride. He had found out too late what Harold Kessler had done. He sent her back? Prescott asked, staring down the wiry telegraph boy in disbelief. Yes, sir. Word is she got taken off at the last station. Said she was heading for Cheyenne to marry Kessler. But he canceled. Prescott gritted his teeth. When? Yesterday, sir. Prescott did not wait another second. He mounted up and kicked the mare into a gallop. He had never laid eyes on her, but something in his chest twisted hard. He knew what sort of man Kessler was: cold, sharp, cruel, and knew what it meant that he had left a woman stranded. Alone. Unwanted. Prescott was not going to let that stand. Tessa sat on a crate near the edge of the platform, her knees drawn in, trying not to cry. The wind had picked up, tugging loose strands of her dark hair from her braid. She had not eaten since the day before, and her stomach ached, but it was nothing compared to the burn in her chest. She had left everything behind in Ohio: her job as a seamstress, the tiny rented room, the few people who remembered her name. She had believed this was a new beginning. Now it felt like the end. The station agent, a quiet man with a crooked nose, had offered her water and a blanket, but no one had room to take her in. Ain't safe out here alone, he said. You best get back on the eastbound tomorrow. She had nodded, but her heart was sinking deeper by the hour. Then, just before dusk, hooves thundered in from the west. Prescott reined the mare in hard, his chest heaving. He scanned the platform and saw her small, pale, sitting alone with her hands clenched in her lap. Tessa Fairley, he called out. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were rimmed red, but still clear. Still strong. Yes, she said slowly, standing. Prescott dismounted, tugging his gloves off. My name's Prescott Baylor. I came to find you. She stared at him, her mouth parting slightly. Why? Because you should not have been left like this, he said. And because I got no use for men like Kessler, but I do have a place that could use someone like you. If you want it. Tessa blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. You came all this way. For me? He nodded once. I could not let you be sent back without a choice. She hesitated, then stepped toward him. Are you offering work? I am offering safety. A room. A warm meal. And maybe, if you want it, something more down the line. I do not believe in rushing things, but I believe in what is right. She looked him over, dusty, broad-shouldered, eyes steady and kind. There was something honest in the way he stood, something that felt like the first breath after drowning. I do not want to go back, she whispered. Then come with me. She climbed onto his mare behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, unsure what this day would bring next. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe she could breathe again. They rode through the darkening plains, the last light of the sun stretching across the open land. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of something waiting to grow. Back at the ranch, Prescott helped her down gently. You can have the guest room. It is yours for as long as you want it. She nodded, overwhelmed, but grateful. He handed her a warm bowl of stew and sat across the table, watching her take a small bite, then another. You came a long way, he said after a moment. I am sorry it started like this. Maybe it was supposed to, she said quietly. Maybe I was not supposed to marry Kessler. Prescott smiled, just barely. No, you were not. She looked up at him, and some of the fear in her chest began to loosen. That night, as she lay beneath quilts in the quiet room, she stared at the ceiling and thought of the way he had ridden in for her. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. And in the stillness, she let herself believe for the first time in a long time that good men still existed. Prescott stood on the porch, staring out into the dark, thinking of her eyes when she had looked at him. There was something in them that made him feel like this was not just about doing the right thing. Maybe this was the start of something real. The morning broke slow over the plains, the light crawling inch by inch across the dewed grass and the low hills. Tessa rose from the narrow bed, the quilt still holding the warmth of the night. She dressed in silence, pulling her shawl snug, unsure what the day would ask of her. In the kitchen, she found Prescott pouring water into a basin by the stove, sleeves rolled past the elbows. He glanced over, then nodded once. "There's coffee. It's strong. Might help." She accepted a tin cup and wrapped both hands around it. "I'd like to help with chores." He looked at her a moment, then motioned his head toward the back door. "We'll start in the barn." Outside, the sun sat low, brushing everything in gold. The wind moved gentle, stirring dust in low spirals. She followed him toward the outbuildings, stepping around puddles from a recent rain. Inside the barn, the air was warm with the smell of hay and animals. He handed her a brush without a word and gestured toward a chestnut gelding. "Dust him down slow. He spooks easy if you rush the shoulders." She took the brush and moved to the horse. Her touch was careful, her motion steady. Prescott worked beside her on another stall, raking out old straw. After a time, he spoke, his voice low. "You got folks back east?" "No one left," she said. "Not for a long while." He didn't press. They worked in quiet rhythm, the horses shifting occasionally, the barn creaking with the wind. Once the stalls were done, he led her out to the lean to where the chickens gathered near scattered feed. He pulled a bucket from the fence post and passed it to her. "You'll get pecked if you hesitate. Best to walk through like you mean it." She stepped into the yard with purpose. The hens clucked and flicked their wings, but let her pass. She scattered the grain with even sweeps. Prescott leaned against the post, watching her move through the flock, his arms folded across his chest. "You ever live outside of town before?" "No," she said, not looking up. "But I can learn." He nodded once. "That's all any of us ever do." They ate midday in the shade of an old elm, a tin plate balanced on each lap. She looked out toward the hills, where the sky pressed low and pale. "What made you come for me?" she asked, not quite turning. He didn't answer right away. "I knew what kind of man Kessler was, and I knew what kind of place this is. No woman should be left alone in it with no name to stand under." She found herself watching him, the way his jaw worked when he chewed, the way he didn't look for praise in what he said. "I didn't want a husband just for a roof," she said. "I wanted something solid, something where I could breathe." He set his plate aside, brushing crumbs from his fingers. "If you stay, you'll have room to decide what you want. I won't ask more than what you offer." That night, she sat on the porch with mending in her lap, the thread pulled neat through worn fabric. Prescott came to sit beside her, his hat in his hands. "You always sew in the evenings?" "It calms my hands. Gives me time to think." "What are you thinking now?" She paused in her stitching, gaze fixed on the horizon. "That I don't feel like a burden here." "Not even once." He nodded slowly. "Because you're not." The silence stretched easy between them, filled with crickets and the last thrum of day. She set the mending aside and tucked her hands under her shawl. "I don't know what you're hoping for," she said, voice quieter than the wind. "But I'm not afraid to start again. Not if it's honest." Prescott looked at her then, not with want, but with the kind of patience that held steady in dust storms and droughts. "We'll build slow," he said. "But we'll build." She looked down, a small breath escaping her lips, not quite a smile, not quite sorrow. "I think I'd like that." By the third week, the rhythm of the place had begun to settle under Tessa's skin like the hush of snowfall. Days passed without announcement, fences mended, feed measured, roofs patched where the prairie wind had worried at the shingles. The ranch didn't run on loud commands or hurried hands. It moved the way Prescott did, quiet, deliberate, and always forward. Tessa stood beneath the clothesline behind the main house, pinning up damp linens while the breeze tugged gently at her sleeves. The air smelled of sun-warmed cotton and the faint sweetness of wild sage. She had taken to scrubbing the wash herself, not because it was expected, but because she liked the feel of her hands in the water and the way the linens whitened in the sun. Prescott came around the side of the house with a coil of fence wire slung over one shoulder. His shirt was damp at the collar, wrists stained with rust. He paused a few paces from her. "Tomas is passing through with cattle next week," he said. "He'll need a place to bed down a night or two. I told him he could use the north paddock." "Will you need help moving the horses?" she asked without looking up. "Just the roan. The others can stay put." She nodded, pinning another corner. "I can lead him out. He follows me easy." "I noticed," Prescott said. His voice held a trace of something softer than usual. She reached for the next sheet. "You don't say much unless it matters. That bother you?" "No. I just notice." He stepped closer, not enough to crowd, but enough she felt the warmth of him even in the wind. "I was raised by a man who spoke loud and meant little," he said. "It taught me to do the opposite." Tessa met his eyes then, startled not by his honesty, but by how gently he gave it. "I was raised by no one," she said after a moment. "I learned to keep things quiet so no one would take them from me." They stood in silence after that, the kind that didn't ask to be filled. The sheet flapped lazily between them. Later that evening, they took supper on the porch. He brought out 2 bowls and a heel of bread, and they ate without ceremony. The sky was streaked with the last orange light, and a meadowlark called from somewhere by the creek. Tessa set her spoon down. "What happened to your hand?" Prescott glanced down. A thin line of dried blood marked the knuckle. Barbed wire slipped. "Should have kept my gloves on." "I can clean it," she offered. "If you want." He held her gaze for a beat, then nodded. "All right." Inside, she brought water and a rag to the table. He sat without protest as she cleaned the cut, her fingers steady and sure. His skin was sun-browned and rough, but the wound was shallow. "You've done this before," he said. "I used to patch up boys who got into fights behind the mill. None of them ever said thank you." He looked at her, his mouth tugging faintly at one corner. "Then I'm sorry for them." She wrapped the cloth around his hand, tying it firm. "You ever been married?" she asked, not out of jealousy, but simple curiosity. "No," he said. "Thought about it once. But she didn't want the land. Just the name." Tessa didn't answer right away. She finished the knot and sat back. "I wanted the opposite," she said. "A chance to be part of something that needed tending." Prescott flexed his hand, testing the cloth. "You think this place needs you?" "I know it does." He studied her, the way her hair had come loose at the temples, the way her hands didn't fidget when she spoke. "Then maybe I do too," he said quietly. She didn't speak, but her eyes held his, steady and open. No fear, no hesitation. That night, after he had gone to the bunkhouse and she lay alone in her bed, she thought about the way he looked at her not like someone fragile, but like someone worth leaning on. Every day here made her feel a little more like herself. Or, perhaps, like someone she'd never been allowed to become until now. Out in the darkness, the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere beyond the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to rest in the quiet knowing that tomorrow would come, and she would meet it standing. The first frost came silent and silver, painting the fields in a veil of cold light. Tessa woke early, breath clouding the air above her quilt, and dressed with quick fingers. The stove in the kitchen still held a low coal glow, and she fed it carefully, coaxing warmth into the room. She had grown used to the quiet hours before dawn, when the house held only the sound of her footsteps and the low creak of settling wood. Outside, Prescott was already splitting kindling near the woodshed, the axe blade flashing in rhythm. She crossed the yard with a scarf tied under her chin, her boots crunching over brittle grass. "Woodpile's shrinking," she said as she reached him. He looked up only briefly. "I'll take the wagon north this week. There's a stand of fir past the ridge that'll hold through winter." She took up a bundle and stacked it neatly beside the door. "You want company on the haul." He set the axe down, adjusting the collar of his coat. "There's timber and ice both. Not easy riding." "I can ride," she said simply. He studied her, not with doubt, but something more careful. "I know." They left after the midday meal, bundled tight, supplies strapped to the back of the buckboard. The trail wound narrow through the hills, patches of snow already crusting beneath the trees. Tessa held the reins while Prescott walked ahead, clearing stones and fallen limbs where he could. "You always work this land alone?" she asked as the wagon creaked beneath them. "For a while," he said. "My brother helped after our father passed, but he married and moved to Oregon 2 winters back. She glanced at him. You hear from him? Letters, sometimes. He's got a daughter now. Says she's got my mother's eyes. Tessa tucked her hands beneath the blanket on her lap. You miss him? I do, he said. But I don't begrudge him what he chose. Peace looks different for every man. They reached the timberline as the sun lowered behind the bluffs. The trees stood tall and close, branches heavy with ice. Prescott set to work felling a few narrow trunks, and Tessa cleared brush, stacking branches in tight bundles. They worked until the shadows grew long and the cold bit sharper, then made camp beside a limestone outcrop. Prescott built a fire with slow concentration, feeding it pine needles and dry bark until the flames took. Tessa unwrapped bread and dried apples from a canvas sack, handing him a share without a word. They ate beside the fire, the quiet not empty but settled, like the hush that comes after a hard rain. Prescott leaned back on his elbows, eyes on the stars beginning to edge into the sky. You ever want children? He asked, the words falling low. She didn't answer right away. There was a time I thought I might, but I never had the choosing of when or how. Maybe I still do. If the choosing is mine. He nodded. It is. She turned to him. And you? I'd like a family, he said, but not one built fast. I've seen what haste does to good intentions. She traced a line in the dirt with the toe of her boot. You think I made a mistake coming west? No, he said. I think the mistake was someone else's. You just had the grit to keep going after it. The fire cracked between them. She felt something inside her settle at those words, not pride, not relief, but a quiet recognition, like hearing her own name spoken after too long. They didn't speak again that night. Prescott unrolled a blanket and gave it to her without hesitation, then lay down a few paces away, his hat pulled low, a rifle resting beside him. She curled beneath the wool and stared at the branches overhead, the stars speckled between them. In the morning, the ground was harder and the wind sharper. They loaded the timber in slow silence, both of them moving in sync without needing to speak. On the ride back, she leaned against the wagon rail and watched the land open wide again, the hills falling back into shadow and light. As the ranch came into view, the sky behind it glowing with the last of the day, Tessa turned to him. You said once you'd give me room to decide. I have. Prescott didn't look away from the trail. And I want to stay, she said. Not as a guest, not as a hand, as yours. He drew the horses to a stop at the gate. The reins slackened in his hands, but he didn't move. You sure? She stepped down from the wagon and looked up at him. I've never been more. He climbed down slowly, the air between them drawn tight, with something unspoken, but deeply known. He reached for her hand, not pulled, not claimed, just offered, and she took it. They walked the last stretch to the house together, boots side by side in the frost-hardened earth. No promises spoken, none needed. The choosing had been made. The hay harvest stretched across 3 long days. By the end of it, Tessa's shoulders ached with a kind of honest weariness that settled deep and quiet. She worked beside Prescott without pause, raking and binding, hands blistered beneath borrowed gloves. There was a rhythm to it, the scythes swing, the rustle of dried stems, the way the wind shifted as if to help them. After the last bundle was lifted into the loft, Prescott climbed down the ladder and turned toward her, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, eyes lit with something unguarded. You held fast, he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. She leaned against a beam, chest rising with each breath. You didn't think I would? I knew you would, he said. Just hadn't seen it yet. That evening, they walked out past the corral where the sky stretched wide and lavender. The horses grazed near the fence, tails flicking lazily. Tessa kept her arms folded, not from cold, but to keep her hands from fidgeting. Prescott walked with a steady gait beside her, close but not touching. You ever think about what comes next? She asked, watching a hawk glide low across the ridge. I do, he said. Some days it's winter stores. Some days it's a roof that'll need replacing by spring. Today, it's you. She stopped walking. What about me? You come into my life quiet as snow, and just as certain. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to want it, either. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. What do you want, Prescott? He took a step closer. To build something that won't break when the wind rises. A home that holds. A life with you, if you'll have it. Tessa searched his face. There was no hesitation in him, only the kind of steadiness that made a woman feel safe without being small. I don't have dowry or fine things, she said. He reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. I don't need fine things. I need the woman who worked beside me, who didn't flinch from frost or silence. I need the woman who sees the land and doesn't turn away. She stepped into him, the front of her skirt brushing his trousers, her voice soft. Then you have her. He kissed her, not hurried, not unsure, but like a promise. She leaned into it with a quiet sound, her hands resting at his chest, and the world tilted just enough to feel changed. By the first snowfall, they were married in the parlor, just the two of them and an old circuit preacher who came through twice a season. Tessa wore a pale wool dress she'd sewn herself, hemmed with blue thread. Prescott shaved, combed his hair, and wore the good coat that had belonged to his father. They exchanged vows with eyes steady and voices low, then shared a supper with cornbread and stew, candles flickering against the frost-laced windows. The following weeks unfolded with a newness that didn't feel jarring, only deeper. She rose before dawn to bake bread, and he met her in the kitchen with a hand on her back and a kiss at her temple. They repaired the porch railing together, laughing when her hammering bent a nail sideways. He built her a small shelf by the stove for her herbs and sewing things. She carved his name, small, into the underside of the dining table. One morning, as she washed linens in the wide tin basin, she paused, hand resting on her belly. She couldn't be sure yet, but something felt different, a warmth, a fullness. She didn't say anything, not until the signs were clearer. When she did, it was late spring, and Prescott was mending a hinge on the barn door. There's something you should know, she said, pressing a folded cloth into his hand. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small stitched square, white muslin edged in yellow, no larger than a man's palm. His eyes lifted. You're sure? She nodded, lips trembling into a smile she couldn't hold back. I'm sure. He stepped toward her, hand resting at the small of her back, brow pressed to hers. You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have. She cupped his face, voice thick. You gave me a life worth growing into. That summer, the fields bloomed tall and green, and the air hung heavy with the hum of bees and the scent of sweetgrass. Tessa moved slower, but still worked beside him, sleeves rolled, curls pinned back from her face. Prescott built a cradle with his own hands, smoothing the edges until they gleamed, and placed it beside their bed. When the child came a girl, small and red-cheeked, they named her Clara for the light that seemed to fill the room the moment she cried. Tessa held her close, humming low, while Prescott stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other cradling his daughter's tiny foot. They didn't speak then. They didn't need to. Years passed, measured not in milestones, but in rhythms: the swing of the porch door, the creak of the rocker, Clara's laughter in the grass, Tessa's voice calling them in before the rain. The ranch held steady, not untouched by hardship, but rooted deep in something stronger than fear. Tessa grew into her place not as a guest, not as a helper, but as a woman fully claimed by the land and the man who had offered her a home without demand. Prescott grew quieter still, but never distant. His love showed in the way he watched her move, the way he reached for her hand across the dinner table, the way he taught their daughter to read by lantern light, his voice low and patient. They aged together, sun-browned and silver at the temples, hands calloused and hearts untroubled. And when the time came for walking slower, for letting the next hands take over the fields, they did so without sorrow. In the evenings, they sat side by side on the porch, faces turned west, where the sun dropped behind the hills and the air smelled of sage and memory. I never thought I'd find this, she said one night, fingers laced with his. He looked out across the land he had once worked alone, now full with the sound of children and the slow hum of peace. You didn't find it, he said. You made it. She turned to him then, eyes warm, and kissed him as the last light slipped beneath the horizon. And they stayed like that, two people who had weathered distance and doubt, who had chosen each other not once, but every single day since. A life not given, but built slow, steady, and entirely theirs.